listening to the Reformanda Initiative podcast, where we analyze and discuss Roman Catholic theology and practice from an evangelical perspective. My name is Clay Kennard. I'm the communications director for the Reformanda Initiative, and I'm joined here by my friends and colleagues, Leonardo De Chirico, who is our director, and Reed Carr, who is our associate director. It's good to have you guys with me this morning for our second episode. So, Reed, will you tell us what we're going to be talking about today?
We have a very important topic to talk about. And as we all know, if you try to understand Roman Catholicism and its theology, it's very quickly overwhelming. It's so vast and complex, and there's just various ways in which you can go about doing that. So we want to talk about this morning, how do we understand Roman Catholic theology? I mean, it's a huge task. How can we even begin to tackle this monster? And so what we're going to do is we'll introduce two words now, and then we'll go throughout this podcast and kind of flesh them out. And there's two approaches that we note to understanding Roman Catholic theology and practice. And one is called an atomistic approach, which is the more common, a very, very common approach to understanding it. And also we want to talk about the systemic approach, which we would favor for sure with the Reformanda Initiative. So they're kind of what probably don't mean a whole lot to you, but we will get into that right now. And one of the books that we'll make reference to is Greg Allison's Roman Catholic Theology and Practice and Evangelical Assessment. Dr. Greg Allison is a regular contributor to the Reformanda Initiative. He's a professor at Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, and he wrote this book to help evangelicals understand Roman Catholic theology and practice. And we'll come to see our good friend and director here, Leo, was very influential in his writing of that book, and specifically the systemic approach to understanding Roman Catholic theology and practice. But the atomistic approach, what does that mean, guys? What does it mean to take an atomistic approach to understanding Roman Catholic theology and practice, which we will all agree is by and large almost the exclusive way that Roman Catholicism is approached? What does it mean, an atomistic approach?
Yeah, by the way, the first theologian that introduced this idea of atomistic approach over against the systemic understanding of Catholicism was the Dutch Reformed theologian Gerrit Berkouwer, who wrote a book in the 50s entitled The Conflict with Rome. And it distinguished between approaching Catholicism atomistically over against approaching it systemically. Atomistically, by using the term atomistic approach or in an atomistic way, he understood it as approaching Catholicism as if it were a collection of bits and pieces, isolated pieces, selecting one doctrine, one practice, one movement, one tradition, or at least one or two, and then projecting this particular atomistic view of Catholicism onto the whole, making claims about what Catholicism is all about, selecting one piece and then making it the whole. In this way, Berkouwer argued that we're actually picking and choosing what we want to see about Catholicism rather than what Catholicism is in its own terms. And I found it very helpful because many books, many treatments, many conversations on Catholicism, they show that they are clearly marked by this atomistic way of looking at Catholicism.
Yeah, well, that was my understanding of Roman Catholicism before coming to Italy. We had prepared ourselves in order to minister in a Roman Catholic context, and the way we did that was by reading literature that had been produced by evangelical scholars, evangelical pastors, missionaries that had served in Roman Catholic contexts, and it was an atomistic approach. And we didn't understand at all that there was another way, a better way in which we needed to approach Roman Catholicism. So we prepared ourselves, like you said, to be able to identify ways we were in agreement with Roman Catholicism as evangelicals and contrast that with, let's say, specific doctrines in which we deviated.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know of many people, and having conversations, especially from the context I come from in the States, in which an atomistic approach is not taken to trying to understand Roman Catholic theology, because it's so vast and complex. It's just how do you do it, and it's easy to isolate doctrines, and if you isolate them, then that means you can just kind of throw them away if you don't like them. And so what happens, and what you hear very often is this idea of, again, going back to this atomistic idea of, okay, so in a conversation between an evangelical and a Catholic, for example, let's talk about what we agreed on, what we disagree on. Even that is that's going to lead to an atomistic conversation. That in the end is almost like a scale or a balance where you add up all the things you agree on, and then you see which one outweighs the other. So and almost always when you since they use such a common vocabulary, if you don't dig down to the meaning of the vocabulary, I think we spoke about that briefly in the first episode, is that we have the same vocabulary but different meanings, of which most of us are unaware. Then you're going to have a lot that outweighs the other. So let's celebrate that, and then let's just don't worry about the things that we don't agree on, because they're isolated anyway, and we can just kind of chop them off like a arm. And like Mariology would be a good example of that. Most anybody, if you asked your average evangelical, what are the big differences between Roman Catholicism and evangelicalism? They say, well, I know they believe some weird things about Mary that we disagree with, and then it kind of gets a little vaguer, more vague from there, and it's one of my favorite questions to ask people when they come here. Like, what are we church planning here in Rome for? Evangelical churches. If we just have some vague differences, because so an atomistic approach helps us to justify that, well, the blurring of lines, or just getting rid of something as if it was totally isolated and unrelated to the whole. But yeah, that certainly was my understanding before I was exposed to Leo's writings and other people who knew a lot more than I did about it.
Yeah, take the example of Mariology you just referred to. If we think about Mariology, Roman Catholic Mariology, in an atomistic way, we lose sight of the fact that Mariology actually grows out of a understanding of Christ, the work of Christ, the sharing of the ministry of Christ, the sharing of it with Mary. And therefore, and also it leads to a different view of the Spirit, because after Christ's resurrection and ascension, the Spirit was given. But if you have Mary as the main helper for the believer, you're actually also undermining the understanding of the Spirit. Christ's work is blurred, the work of the Spirit is confused, and therefore you have a Trinitarian problem arising out of Mariology. And then you have an ecclesiological problem, because Mary is the mother of the church. And so the whole picture of the church is also marred by Mariology. And we have only touched upon very few dogmatic issues related to the Trinity, Christology, pneumatology, ecclesiology, and we have not even touched the world of practices and devotions to Mary that are so openly impacted and influenced by pagan ideas. So even, the point of Mariology, it is not only a Mariological issue that we discuss, our views about Mary on this and that point. It opens up a whole world, theological world, devotional world, spiritual world, where the Trinity, Christ, the Spirit, the Church, they're all involved. And of course, the Bible is also involved, our view of the Word of God, our view of the authority of Scripture. So if we take Mariology in an atomistic way, we just have a reduced and limited view and understanding of what Mariology actually is all about. But if we have an a systemic understanding, every doctrine, every practice we discuss, every doctrine we discuss, they're all windows into a whole. And we have to understand Catholicism as an interconnected whole.
Yeah, so just to summarize for everyone listening, atomistic way of approaching Roman Catholicism is approaching it in isolated doctrines that don't connect or impact one another necessarily. Systemic, on the other hand, understands Roman Catholic theology to be a coherent, all-encompassing system. So as Leo just explained, everything is interconnected. And that is what we are trying to do as a Reformanda Initiative, is help the evangelical world understand that the proper way in which we need to approach Roman Catholic theology and practice is with this systemic approach.
One thing we mentioned last episode, which has a strong influence on this, is that we made the observation that even Roman Catholic theology is a blind spot in the evangelical world, and it would be right to say, I think, that that's largely due to an atomistic approach to understanding Roman Catholicism, where you just compare things in an isolated way and just discard what you don't like and celebrate what you do like. And so going back to this systemic idea, which we're leading into, and Leo, you wrote a dissertation at King's College in London on this very idea, which I had, as I mentioned earlier, was influential in Greg Allison's work. And your dissertation was reduced into a book called Evangelical Theological Perspectives on Post-Vatican II Roman Catholicism. So what brought you to this systemic understanding of approaching Roman Catholic theology?
Well, it was the realization that after the Second Vatican Council, after the 60s, there had not been many evangelical attempts to understand, approach, assess Roman Catholicism as a whole. And yet evangelicals were opening up to a season of dialogue with Rome without having done proper homework in preparing for such a task. And they were already signs of shallow, superficial outcomes coming out of those dialogue. And so I tried to figure out in which way evangelical theology can contribute to a meaningful dialogue with Rome without being trapped into this reduced and superficial way of dealing with it. And this is not just superimposing an external foreign paradigm onto Catholicism. Catholicism thinks of itself as being a whole. Catholic means according to the whole. Catholicism means according to the whole. So it is not something that we do imposing our own grid. That is not part of what Catholicism is in itself. It is just being fair to what Catholicism is. And so Berkouwer was an influential author to deal with, as well as previous theologians who had come to the understanding that Catholicism was a system, was not only a bunch of isolated doctrines and practices, but a whole system of life, thought, and spirituality. And so that was what prompted me to try to study this issue.
So this systemic approach, juxtaposed against an atomistic approach, understands, as we've been saying, Roman Catholic theology to be a unit. It's a single whole. All the parts, they're like cogs in a clock that if you take that out, the clock will not work anymore. Or a bike, a bike cog, it's just not going to work anymore. So there's certain tenets to Roman Catholicism that make it work and make it tick. And you have to understand those in order to understand Roman Catholicism. Now, in your dissertation, you refer to Roman Catholicism as a complex unity. It's unified but not uniform.
Yes, exactly.
What does that mean exactly? Help us to understand what it means to be a complex unity, or unified but not uniform.
For Catholicism to be a complex unity means that it is not a monolith, it is not a static, one-sided reality, but it is a living reality, maintaining forms and degrees of unity, as well as allowing measures of diversity, regional diversities, historical diversities, devotional diversities, traditional diversities, and so on and so forth. And yet, combining all these diversities into a unified, in the case of Catholicism, also institutional unity that has to do with the structure of the Church, the Roman-centered nature of the Catholic Church, and so we have to navigate through this reality that combines things together and yet allows degrees of differences. If we emphasize one aspect of Catholicism, the unity of it, at the expense of its diversity, we miss the point. We have a static, flattened view of Catholicism. On the other hand, if we overemphasize the differences within Catholicism, and often it is the case that people say, oh, the charismatic movement is very different from the Marian traditions or the traditionalist papists of the past. Yes, but at the same time they are connected because they belong to the same institutional system. And so we always have to deal with both, doing justice to both, and trying to come up with a unified yet dynamic understanding of what Catholicism is all about.
I know in your dissertation you also reference David Wells, who wrote a book in the 70s reflecting on Vatican II called Revolution in Rome, and I think he battled with this as well and talked about the seeming contradictions in Catholic theology, but that are still under the same Catholic umbrella.
Yeah, that's right. Because if we approach in Catholicism in a one-sided way, we end up in looking at it as something full of contradictions, something full of contrasts. And in a way, it is the case that Catholicism has many tensions within it. It's not a flattened type of unity. But at the same time, we have to understand that Catholicism operates with this both-and type of epistemological approach. It's both-and, both theological and devotional, both hierarchical and popular, both sacramental and mystical, both Marian and in a way Christ-centered. So it's always both and so if we don't have this systemic view of Catholicism enabling us to come to terms with both the unity and the diversity of the system, we end up in finding ourselves lost and then coming to superficial evaluations.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Leo. So we have something for our listeners that we want to present to you. It's a clip with a famous evangelical pastor, Rick Warren. And what we want to do is we want you to listen to this in order to try to understand what type of approach Rick Warren is taking when he speaks about Roman Catholicism.
We have far more in common than what divides us. When you talk about Pentecostals, charismatics, evangelicals, fundamentalists, Catholics, Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, on and on and on. Well, they would all say, we believe in the Trinity, we believe in the Bible, we believe in the resurrection, we believe salvation is through Jesus Christ. These are the big issues. Sometimes Protestants think that Catholics worship Mary like she's another God, but that's not exactly Catholic doctrine. There's the understanding, and people say, well, what are the saints all about? Why are you praying to the saints? And when you understand what they mean by what they're saying, there's a whole lot more commonality. Now, there's still real differences. No doubt about that. But the most important thing is, if you love Jesus, we're on the same team. The unity that I think we would see realistically is not a structural unity, but a unity of mission. And so when it comes to the family, we are co-workers in the field on this for the protection of what we call the sanctity of life, the sanctity of sex, and the sanctity of marriage. So there's a great commonality, and there's no division on any of those three. Many times people have been beaten down for taking a biblical stance. And they start to feel, well, maybe I'm out here all by yourself. No, you're not. The church is growing in Latin America. The church is growing in Asia. The church is growing in Africa. It's not growing in North America or Europe, but it is growing everywhere else. And so we kind of have this feeling that maybe we're not as influential, but we're far more influential than people realize.
There we have it. What we've just presented to all of you is a purpose-driven sound clip, and we hope it's going to serve our purpose. So did we hear from Rick Warren here an atomistic or a systemic approach to understanding Roman Catholicism? Reed, Leo?
Well, I think that those statements clearly exemplify a good heart when it comes to the unity of the church, the mission of the church. There is no doubt about that. Evidently, they also reflect an atomistic way of understanding Catholicism. And it comes out, I make two points about these statements. First of all, the equation of Roman Catholicism as yet another Christian denomination. There are Pentecostals, there are Methodists, there are fundamentalists, and then there are Roman Catholics. Now that underestimates the claims of the Catholic Church, that is not, doesn't consider itself as one among the many. And so it doesn't really do justice or make justice to the claims of Rome itself. It imposes on Rome a relativistic view of the church that Rome doesn't agree upon. And so it is atomistic in the sense that it doesn't reflect what the Church of Rome really thinks about herself. She doesn't participate in the dialogue around the table as one among peer churches on a peer level. It participates as being the church. Secondly, I think there is an atomistic way of approaching Catholicism by talking about mission, detaching it from doctrine. We have a common mission. We have many differences, but we have a common mission. And this is atomistic in the sense that we cannot have the same mission if we don't agree on the same basics of the gospel. This is an overstatement, not a proper statement. And it shows that we have a missiology that is in danger of being detached from and separated from biblical doctrine. And if this is the case, this is not a Christian mission. It is something different.
Rick Warren said in that clip, we believe in the Trinity, we believe in the Bible, we believe in the resurrection, we believe in the salvation, that salvation is through Christ. These are the big issues. So like Leo was saying, in order to be in agreement on the same mission, we have to be in agreement on the core fundamental doctrines of the faith. But Rick Warren seems to think that we are. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, to go back and answer the question, obviously this is a classic atomistic approach to understanding Roman Catholicism. Just even his first the very first statement, we have far more in common than what divides us, is exactly what we were talking about before. The good outweighs the bad. Let's celebrate that and set aside what divides us. And then, as you were saying, we believe in the Trinity, we believe in the Bible, we believe in the resurrection, we believe that salvation is through Jesus Christ. These are the big issues, but these issues don't get defined here. Again, it goes back to the common vocabulary that we share and the assumption that those words have the same meaning attached to them. Salvation, what is salvation exactly? Well, an evangelical on doctrine alone would have a very different response to that question than a Catholic would. Talking about works and then the Trinity, Leo referred earlier to just even how the Mariology in Roman Catholicism blurs and confuses doctrine of the Holy Spirit. And so we have to be very careful just to say, oh yes, we believe in all these things without defining them and really understanding what we're talking about. Otherwise, we risk a mission, as Rick Warren says in this thing. If you listen to what his mission was, it's about family values. That's great. I mean, we can have those are important, but that's far from the gospel. If our mission is centered around preaching and teaching Jesus Christ crucified, a salvation through grace alone, through faith alone, then that's a different mission. And our collaboration on family, sexuality is important and it's great, but we have to be clear about a mission. And I think the atomistic approach, that one of the risks and dangers of it is a watered down mission that turns into just family values. Rick Warren also says in this clip that he says this: when you understand what they mean by what they are saying, there's a whole lot more commonality. Now, there are still real differences, no doubt about that, he says, but the most important thing is, if you love Jesus, we're on the same team.
Well, we could say that about Mormons. We could say that about Jehovah's Witnesses. So what does it mean in this situation to be on the same team?
I think that's the question, the key. If you love Jesus, we're on the same team. And again, of course, this highlights another atomistic approach to the commonalities. There's differences for sure, but we have much more in common. And really, if we love Jesus, we're on the same team. But to be on the same team, that's what it's all about. If we love Jesus, what does it mean to love Jesus? What does it mean to be on the same team? What does it mean to be on mission together? And these are the things we have to drill into. We said our convictions as the Reformanda Initiative is that we believe that Roman Catholicism is a severely flawed theological system in need of a radical biblical reformation. And an atomistic approach to Roman Catholicism is not going to get you anywhere in understanding that. So that's why we needed a systemic approach. That's why we have to understand it as an all-encompassing system. And to reemphasize what we've also said in the past, we're not about destroying unity or trying to cause problems where there shouldn't be. That's not it at all. But it is all about the gospel. And we've made that point several times, and it will continue to be all about the gospel. And if the gospel gets watered down, then the church has to stand up and say, hold on, we can't be a part of this. And we want unity, but we want unity to be shaped and defined by the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is defined in Scripture alone.
Yeah, we saw in Rick Warren's example that this atomistic approach leads to a false type of unity.
Yeah, I also think that the clip shows the lack of historical awareness, as if the Catholic Church was, a newborn ecclesiastical body and not the millennia-long historical, Roman-centered, papal, political institution. And that also shows a superficial understanding of Catholicism. It also shows a pragmatic view of mission, whereby love covers all at the expense of doctrine, a lack of understanding of the Roman Catholic understanding of their own doctrines. They, sincere and conservative Catholics, would not really buy into this shallow, superficial understanding of doctrine. You just love Jesus and we are on the same team. This is also, it looks like very ecumenical, open-minded, but actually it imposes on your Catholic counterpart something that they don't believe. And so I actually find it quite wrong and also disturbing for the fact that we try to make our counterpart someone like us without really hearing what he or they are saying, and without really grasping what Catholic theology is all about. It's about making the world a world of gray, different shades of gray, without appreciating the black, the white, the differences, the colors, and making everything blurred and confused.
And we're almost out of time for this episode, but we've made several references here to Vatican II, and we don't want to assume that our listeners know exactly what we're referring to, so that's actually a whole other episode itself. And we've also obviously talked a lot about a systemic approach to understanding Roman Catholicism, but we've talked about kind of the pillars on which Catholicism is built, the cogs on which it turns, the core of its system, but we haven't identified exactly what that core is yet, and that is essential to understand a systemic approach. And that's what we're going to dedicate our next two episodes to. And those two pillars are what Greg Allison in his book refers to as the nature-grace interdependence. And I know this won't mean hardly anything at this point, but that's what we're going to dive into in the next episodes. And the second one is the Christ-Church interconnection. And if you remove one of these pillars, everything, that system collapses. And all of Catholic doctrine can point back to one of these pillars. Mary makes sense when you read Marian doctrine through one of these pillars. And again, it collapses without them. And so this conversation here is foundational to the whole entire podcast and to the Reformanda Initiative and how we understand Roman Catholicism. But without a doubt, the nature-grace interdependence discussion, as well as the Christ-Church interconnection, which again are fancy terms, but the concepts that they represent are quite easy to understand, and that's what we're going to flesh out in the next couple episodes. But listen to those because they're foundational to understanding the rest of all the podcasts. And Clay, remind us how people and our listeners can follow the Reformanda Initiative, how they can contact us if they have questions. And
well, you can find us online at www.reformandainitiative.org. If you're on social media, you can find us on Facebook at Reformanda Initiative and also on Twitter at Reformanda Rome. On our website, we have a form, so if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. And also subscribe to the podcast. If you have any questions, we're here to listen, and we'd be happy to help out. So, yeah, please follow us.
All right, thanks, guys, and thank you to our listeners, and check in next time for episode 3.